Welcome, Rose, to Saturday Morning Academy. Today we'll be looking at the landmark cases of the Supreme Court. So we're looking at those cases: Marbury v. Madison, McCulloch v. Maryland, Gibbons v. Ogden, Worcester v. Georgia, and Dred Scott versus Sanford. So let's look at Marbury v. Madison first. So it happened during the New Republic era. When did it take place? March 1803. Hopefully, guys see that the key information is highlighted in gold. Who was involved? It was John Adams, William Marbury, and James Madison. So let's figure out what was taking place. So as Adams was leaving office, he made 42 judicial appointments. These were what we call the midnight appointments. To the Senate, Marbury was to become Justice of the Peace in D.C. The Senate confirmed all 42 appointments. The acting Secretary of State, James Madison, failed to deliver 4 commissions. The next day, Jefferson took office and he denied the 4 commissions to take office. Why? Marbury believed that he had a right to the office and took the case to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court decided against Marbury. Madison's decision established the principle of judicial review. What is judicial review? It's that power of the federal courts to declare legislative and executive acts unconstitutional. Unconstitutional means it goes against the Constitution. So, what was the result of that case? We now have the principle of judicial review. So, McCulloch v. Maryland again takes place during the early Republic era. In the year of 1819, who was involved? James McCulloch, the National Bank, and the state government of Maryland. This took place in Baltimore, Maryland. So why did it happen? In 1816, Congress chartered the Second Bank of the United States. Remember, we talked about the establishment of the National Bank during Hamilton's presidency. So in 1818, the state of Maryland passed legislation to impose taxes on the bank. James W. McCulloch, the cashier of the bank branch, Baltimore branch of the bank, refused to pay those taxes. The state appeals court held that the second bank was unconstitutional because the Constitution did not provide a textual commitment for the federal government to charter a bank. That goes back to that argument between Jefferson and Hamilton. What took place in a unanimous decision? The court held that the Congress had the power to incorporate the bank and that Maryland could not tax instruments of the national, federal, or central government employed in the execution of constitutional powers. It goes back to that necessary and proper clause Washington used in order to create the first national bank. So Chief Justice Marshall noted that Congress possessed the powers to explicitly outlined in the U.S. Constitution. Marshall redefined necessary to mean appropriate and legitimate, covering all methods of furthering objectives covered by the enumerated powers. So what was the result? States not being able to tax federal government. So the states cannot tax federal government. Gibbons v. Ogden again takes place during the New Republic, March of 1824. It involves the New York waterways. Who was involved? Thomas Gibbons and Aaron Ogden. Okay, so what was going on? Thomas Gibbons was a steamboat owner who did business between New York and New Jersey under a federal coastal license. Former he had a former partnership with Ogden, which fell apart after 3 years when Gibbons operated another steamboat on a New York route belonging to Ogden. Ogden filed suit against Gibbons in New York State Court and received a permanent injunction, which means that Ogden no longer had the right to um, continue working on the New York waterways. The New York State Court rejected Gibbons' argument, asserting that the U.S. Congress controlled interstate commerce. Why? Justice Marshall concluded that the regulation of navigation by steamboat operators and others for purposes of conducting interstate commerce was a power reserved to and exercised by the Congress under the Commerce Clause, as interstate navigation fell under interstate commerce. New York could not interfere with it, and the law was therefore invalid. So, this case resulted in the federal government controlling interstate commerce. Worcester v. Georgia. This case also took place during the early republic. In March of 1832, it took place in the state of Georgia. Who was involved? Worcester, Cherokee Nation, the state of Georgia, and Chief Justice Marshall. Worcester and other non-Native Americans were living on Cherokee land. Worcester argued that the states could not maintain the prosecution because the statute violated the Constitution, regulating trade with Indian nations. The Constitution did not give the government the power to regulate those treaties with an Indian nation. Why? In an opinion delivered by Chief Justice John Marshall, the court held that the Georgia Act, under which Worcester was prosecuted, violated the Constitution, treaties, and laws of the United States. Chief Justice Marshall argued the Cherokee Nation then is a distinct community occupying its own territory in which the laws of Georgia can have no force. So that resulted in the states not having the right to impose regulations on Native American land because it was seen as a sovereign nation. So the Native American land was seen as a sovereign nation. That takes us to the Dred Scott versus Sanford case. Again, this actually took place during secularism right before the Civil War. It was actually one of the causes of the Civil War. In 1857, Dred Scott, John Emerson, and Eliza Sanford, not dismissing Dred Scott's wife, who was also a part of the case. This took place in Missouri. So in 1846, after laboring and saving for years, the Scots sought to buy their freedom from Sanford, but she refused. Dred Scott then sued Sanford in a state court, arguing that he was legally free because he and his family had lived in a territory where slavery was banned. In 1850, the state court finally declared Scott free. So the state court agreed with Scott and declared that he was free. After years of new filings and appeals, the Supreme Court hears the case. The court argued that Scott's status as a citizen of a free state did not necessarily give him status as a U.S. citizen. While the states were free to create their own citizenship criteria and had done so before the Constitution even came into being, the Constitution gives Congress exclusive authority to define national citizenship. So this resulted in Justice Taney ruling that African Americans, free or enslaved, are considered property. Therefore, they have no rights and cannot be considered citizens. All right, guys. So we have talked about Marbury v. Madison. We've talked about McCulloch v. Maryland. We talked about Gibbons v. Ogden, Worcester v. Georgia, and Dred Scott versus Sanford. So take this information, and you should be able to continue with the activity that has been planned for you for today. Have a great one.